In last week's podcast, we took a look at the beginning of the story that features Joseph in Genesis 37. Recall that Joseph had managed to infuriate his brothers for several reasons. One, he had badmouthed his siblings about how they were running the family business. Two, he was obviously favored by his father. Three, he told his brothers dreams that suggested he would rule over them. While Joseph's brothers were still seething from these affronts, their tone-deaf father sent Joseph to check up on them and on their flocks. It did not help that Joseph was able to stay home while his siblings were working in the fields. Of course, Joseph did not find his brothers in Shechem, since they had already moved on to Dothan. Fortunately, a man had overheard the brothers say that they were indeed going to Dothan, so Joseph went there too. The conflict which we anticipated when Joseph arrived is about to come to a head. It is at that point where we resume our story. When Joseph was some distance from his brothers, they spotted him as he was approaching. That's in verse 18 of chapter 37. They decided immediately to conspire against their aggravating brother, whom they had come to despise. The extent of their rage was revealed when they figured that they would kill Joseph outright. They contemptuously referred to their brother as this dreamer. The plot was simple. They would kill Joseph on the spot, throw the body into a pit, and later concoct a story that he had been killed by a wild animal. That's in verse 19. That would quite obviously put an end to his preposterous dreams. But before the plan could be implemented, the oldest brother, namely Reuben, whose mother was Leah, argued against this extreme tactic. Instead, Reuben argued, Joseph should simply be put in a pit and left alone. Presumably, either the elements or wild critters would eventually take care of their impudent brother. However, Reuben had other plans. When he got the chance, he wanted to rescue Joseph and get him back to Jacob, their father. Reuben wanted no part of his siblings' murderous scheme. That's in verse 22. As long as Reuben was around, Joseph had a fighting chance. When Joseph got to his brothers, right away they took off his special robe that Jacob had given him. Then they unceremoniously threw him into a pit, which mercifully had no water in it. That's in verse 24 of chapter 37. No one said a thing to Joseph, nor had he uttered a word. Poor Joseph found himself stranded in a pit without his special garment. After dispatching Joseph, his brothers sat down to eat. Right then a caravan of Ishmaelites on the way from Gilead came by. They were on the way to Egypt, carrying gum, balm, and myrrh. These were important trading commodities. That's in verse 25. Judah, another son of Leah's, spoke up at this point. He had the bright idea that there was no profit in killing Joseph, but by selling him they could accomplish two goals. One, they could get rid of this family nuisance once and for all, and two, they could make a little money in the process. Judah's appeal to reason is, of course, ludicrous. He makes it sound like he is a paragon of virtue in wanting to save Joseph's life because, after all, he is our brother. Somehow the gross immorality of selling a brother into certain slavery is not viewed as hypocritical nonsense. In any case, Joseph is sold. This time the caravan is identified as Midianite. One way or another, however, Joseph has been sold by his own brothers. For a mere 20 shekalim, or shekels, of silver, the members of the caravan were allowed to fetch Joseph out of the pit and continue on their way to Egypt. That's in verses 27 to 28 of chapter 37. Reuben apparently was not around when this transaction took place. Remember that he had planned to rescue Joseph on the sly and somehow get him home. But when he got to the pit, he discovered that Joseph was gone. He tore his clothes as a sign of lament and despondency. Then he ran to his brothers to protest what they had done. Seeing himself as responsible, he was, after all, the eldest brother, he complained that Joseph was gone, and he now had to face their father with such god-awful news. That's in verse 30. All the brothers then figured that they had to do something to cover their tracks. They supposed that their father would assume that Joseph had found them. That meant that they had to account for his disappearance. This is where Joseph's coat that his brothers had taken off of him now came into play. They killed a goat and then dipped the coat into its blood. Then they brought the coat to Jacob and asked him whether he recognized the garment as belonging to Joseph. Immediately, Jacob was able to identify the coat as the one he had given to his son. Not only that, but Jacob also surmised how blood got onto the coat. It was because Joseph had fallen victim to a wild animal. Jacob had to deal with the reality that his beloved son had been torn to pieces by some predator. That led Jacob to tear his own clothes, don sackcloth, and start mourning. Jacob was completely distraught. That's in verses 32 through 34 of chapter 37. All of Jacob's children did their best to console their bereaved father, but nothing worked. Jacob believed that he would himself die, go down to Sheol, the pit, the realm of the dead, in a state of heart-wrenching distress. He would get no relief. Weeping from now was his lot. Of course, the sons who were trying to comfort their father knew very well what had happened to Joseph. They were absolutely responsible for his disappearance. Seeing Jacob all but give up on life would surely weigh on them. Granted, life would go on, but it would not be a happy life. Jacob remained beside himself. In the meantime, the Midianites reached Egypt. They had more than gum, balm, and myrrh to sell now. They would get top dollar for a slave. Sure enough, the Midianites were able to sell Joseph to an Egyptian man named Potiphar. But this was no ordinary Egyptian. As it turned out, Potiphar was not only an officer of the great Egyptian Pharaoh, he was the captain of the guard. This officer became Joseph's master. Jacob believed that Joseph was dead and therefore gone forever. But the narrator lets us know that Joseph is alive. That is perhaps good news. But there is bad news as well, namely that Joseph, once a favored son in Jacob's family, now found himself a slave in a foreign country. Death may have been preferable. In podcast number 93, I dealt with Genesis 38, the story that comes right after this story featuring Joseph, which is obviously in chapter 37. It's chapter 39 that narrates the circumstances of Joseph's new situation in Potiphar's house. After a summary that explains how Joseph came to be part of Potiphar's household in verse 1 of chapter 39, we encounter an interesting statement. We learn that the Lord, the very deity who had called Abraham and Sarah, was with Joseph. There is little explanation about what this means, though. Is this something of which Joseph was aware? Did this say something about Joseph's relationship with his God? The only explanation we get is as follows. Joseph became successful. That seems to suggest that he performed his duties in the Potiphar household competently, efficiently, and diligently. Indeed, Joseph's master, Potiphar, noticed that the Lord was with him. From Potiphar's perspective, the Lord's being with Joseph explained his extraordinary success in carrying out his tasks. This circumstance resulted in Joseph's getting more and more responsibility. In fact, Potiphar put Joseph in charge of all his affairs. This eventuated in the Lord's blessing excessively Potiphar's whole household. This was, of course, for Joseph's sake, but Potiphar benefited from this as well. Potiphar only had to worry about his food. Joseph took care of everything else. That's in verses 2 through 6 of chapter 39. This was almost too good to be true. Sold as a slave, Joseph landed on his feet. Doubtlessly, he did not want to be a slave, but given that that was his lot, his situation was better than any average slave. Given the circumstances, Joseph was in a good place. Next week, we will deal with the next part of the story, the time when Joseph's life came crashing down on him for a second time. Let me remind you that I'm trying to get set up for our mini courses by the end of January. I'll keep you informed by that information. In the meantime, you can go to my website, faspina.com. Let me know what your email is so that I can contact you. If you'd like to have me ask you, if you would like to ask me a question, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. Thank you.